How are an English Revolution of 1688, some dude taking over the New York colony the following year, and the American Revolution of 1775 connected? Well, I'll tell you in this week's episode of Learning Out Loud. Hi, I'm your host, Katie, and this podcast is all about sharing some new things I learned in some of my favorite topics like history, science, and pretty much anything and everything in between. That sounds like a good time to you. Let's get right into this week's episode. Welcome to episode 2 of our Rebellion series. So this rebellion I'd actually never heard of and found out about it after Googling list of American rebellions in preparation for this series. So what is the rebellion? The rebellion of the week is called Leisler's Rebellion, named after Jacob Leisler, the leader of said rebellion. So for this week, we're not straying too far in the distance or time from last week's rebellion, so it'll be interesting to see the similarities and differences between the two. So we find ourselves in the southern portion of the New York colony in 1689, where our irregular dude, well, he's not really regular, we'll find out why in a minute, but our dude, Jacob Leisler, has taken control of the local government and holds on to that power for the next 18 months. How was he able to do this, and what were the circumstances that led up to this rebellion? Those are some of the questions we'll be answering. But first, who was Jacob Leisler? He was born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany in 1640 to a prominent and wealthy Calvinist family. Calvinism or Reformism is a type of Protestant Christianity developed by John Calvin in the 1530s, and it had its largest followings in France and the Netherlands. Many Calvinists immigrated to North America in the 1600s, especially a group called the Huguenots, who were French Calvinists fleeing Catholic persecution. But back to Leisler. His father was a Calvinist minister and was well known throughout Europe for fundraising for the Reformed refugees. Leisler was sent to military school at just the age of 11 after his father's death, and by age 20, he was an officer for the Dutch West India Company stationed in New Amsterdam, which is modern-day New York. Leisler became a successful New York City merchant from the 1660s to the 1680s, and this was most likely aided by his father's connections to several wealthy Dutch patrons in the Delaware area. Leisler was a supplier of finished cloth and trade goods, slave and indentured human cargoes, and liquors and wine in exchange for tobacco and grain products. By age 34, Leisler was the 7th richest man in New York City, and 2 years after that, he was in a 4-way tie for 3rd place. An interesting story about Leisler is that in 1677, while on one of his trading ships with his crew and stepsons and nephew, they were captured by Algerian pirates in the English Channel. He had enough money for him to pay for his release, but everyone else had to remain in captivity. And from the way the article was written, it sounds like they were never released, or at least that wasn't the focus of the article. But we do know that at least one of his stepsons died while in captivity. So not only did he lose his stepson, he also lost his ship and goods on that piracy excursion. But he had also been swindled at home while he was out to sea. So when he comes back from that harrowing experience, he finds himself almost drained of his entire finances. However, he recovered most of his losses in lawsuits that he had filed for said losses. And when his mother-in-law died, she was possibly the richest woman in New York, and all of it went to Leisler and his wife. Over the years, Leisler would be appointed to numerous positions of civil, military, and judicial authority during his time in New York, during both Dutch and English rule. But most important to him was his religion. He was a deacon and a member of the consistory within the New Amsterdam Reformed Church. But as a reformist, he believed that resistance is legitimate when true doctrine is threatened. This is evident when a Roman Catholic duke assigned to Albany, New York, sued Leisler basically for libel, and Leisler refused to apologize or to take it back, even when threatened with jail time. The governor actually had to step in before things escalated. He was also very passionate about helping Huguenot refugees and even bought the freedom of a refugee family that was sold into indentured servitude. He also bought several thousand acres of land and set aside a large portion of it for the refugees. Now, I think it would be a good time for me to explain the setup of this area during Leisler's time because it plays an important role in the story, and country ownership changes hands throughout the course of it. And I actually had no idea about any of New York's history. I always assumed all of the original 13 colonies were owned by England from the jump, but that's actually not the case. The colony of New Netherland was established by the Dutch West India Trading Company in 1624, and it grew to include modern-day New York City, parts of Long Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Another Dutch colony began to grow along the southern tip of Manhattan Island and was named New Amsterdam. The Dutch governor of the colony tried to make the land ownership legit by buying the land from the local native tribe called the Manhattans. Both sides agreed, but the Manhattans didn't really understand the concept of land ownership. And as the Dutch kept trying to expand their colony, this led to armed conflict with the natives, which resulted in over 1,000 deaths of both colonists and Manhattans. There was a bit of back and forth ownership of the area between the Dutch and the English, but in 1674, New York was returned to the English and would remain that way until the American Revolution. Another important thing to remember is that up until this time, most of the colonies were run on private and or commercial charters, so they had a little bit more relative independence from the English crown. They had their own legislators and laws until the English monarchy started seeing how successful the colonies were becoming, and they wanted to be able to control that success and to take part of it. At first, in the 1660s, the English Parliament passed a series of laws to try to regulate trade in the American colonies, which were called the Navigation Acts, but the colonies refused. And since they refused to comply, King Charles II was like, fine, I'm annulling all your charters and you're all one big dominion now. This began in 1684, and by 1688 it included the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and East and West Jersey. This helped reduce the administrative costs of running so many smaller colonies and establish the same set of laws, rules, government type, and taxes, and reign in the colony's freedom. This also helped to better regulate trade and reform land title practices to be under more English methods. England also wanted to have a united front against France, who owned most of the land surrounding the English colonies. King Charles II also wanted to unite the colonies under the Church of England, which pissed off a lot of the colonies, whose biggest reason for leaving England in the first place was freedom from religious persecution. The capital of the Dominion was in Boston, and many Massachusetts magistrates, let's try to say that 5 times fast. The Massachusetts magistrates refused to serve on the new council. And what I call a badass move, the former council under the previous charter kind of saw the writing on the wall and repealed all of the government revenue laws the year before, so that when the new English leader of the Dominion, Joseph Dudley, came in, he was not given the power to create revenue laws, and so he had no way of generating any revenue for this new Dominion government because he could not rely on former laws since they had been wiped off the books. So the former Massachusetts legislator was like, yeah, you're not going to be getting any money from us. Bye. And then most of the colonists refused to pay any of the remaining taxes that were still around anyway, since they claimed that they were made under the previous government and argued they were no longer valid. So either way, They're like, yeah, we're going to actually take all the tax laws and off the table so that you can't come in and use them. But also, if there are any stragglers we forgot to get rid of, we're not going to abide by them because that government doesn't exist anymore because you kind of took it away. England sends in the big guns and puts former New York Governor Sir Edmund Andros in charge of the Dominion, and he gets straight to business. Andros claims that the colonists left behind all their rights as Englishmen when they left England, even though they're now a part of an English colony. Don't know how that really works. He forced a Puritan minister to hand over the keys to his church so that there could be a Church of England services after many of the other Puritan churches refused. He also created a series of tax laws that were very similar to Massachusetts's old laws, but he increased the import duties on alcohol to generate immediate revenue because they really needed money. Many Massachusetts areas refused to accept the tax laws, and officials from those areas were arrested and fined. Other colonies accepted the new laws, but none were happy about it, especially because the tax rates were increased and hit poor landowners really hard. Andros also restricted town meetings and gatherings to once a year to avoid any further organization of protests. See, remember from last week? That's a very key ingredient to stop rebellions and uprisings. You can't make it illegal for people to gather in groups. He also started to implement the English way of handing out land titles that would force landowners to essentially reapply for their land titles that they already had, but without the guarantee that they'd actually get their land back. After these restrictions and heavy taxes, we see the first protest by colonists citing violations of the Magna Carta, which guaranteed taxation by representation of the people. Does this sound familiar? And just a reminder, this is the late 1600s, so we're already starting to kind of see some of the reasons for revolution in the American Revolution. We're seeing it as early as the late 1600s. And I will also say that Massachusetts, they stay being the center of rebellion because they're kind of the leader in this series, and 100 years later, they're also the main rebel rousers for the American Revolution. So back to the Massachusetts colonists. They'd had enough of Andros and his shenanigans, and they decided to send a representative, a man by the name of Increase Mather, to talk to King James. At this point, King Charles II had died in 1685. So it seems like Andros and his homies knew their plans to try to get someone to send someone directly to King James. So Mather actually had to sneak out onto a ship after having been caught and arrested on a previous attempt to sneak out and sail to England. Mather was well received by King James, and the king promised that he would address the colonists' concerns in a few months' time. However, something called the English Glorious Revolution takes place, and King James, who was a Catholic, was deposed by William II and Mary II, who were Protestants. We're not going to get into the details of this glorious revolution, but the key point for our story is that this is kind of the catalyst for Leisler's Rebellion. And not only Leisler's Rebellion, as we'll learn. Since Mather was still there, he asked the new monarchs and the lords of trade to reinstate Massachusetts's old charter. He starts scheming, and he convinces them to delay notifying Andros of the revolution and that they are now the king and queen of England. So Mather gets the word out to a former colonial governor, Simon Bradstreet, that the charter had been illegally annulled and to, quote, prepare the minds of the people for a change, end quote. And Bradstreet is back in Boston. Essentially, he and others organize a group to revolt against Andros in 1689, and they end up arresting him and other Dominion leaders. And this basically leads to the collapse of the Dominion. All right, So now that we've set the stage, let's go back to New York and Leisler. At the time of King James' annexation of New York and East Jersey into the Dominion, the people of those areas were not happy about it. While I'm sure they were upset over the tax and land title overhauls, the bigger concern for a lot of them was religious freedom. Remember, Leisler and a lot of New Yorkers were Protestants, and many had fled France's Catholic rule. And also to note, the royalty is all related. So the French King Louis XIV is King James's cousin, and they are both Catholic rulers. The fear in the New York colony was that King James would unleash the same type of violence and persecution on the English Protestants that his nephew did in France. So news of the Glorious Revolution and Boston's rebellion reached New York and Leisler, but surprisingly, Leisler was slow to join the rebellion. He was actually a part of the lieutenant governors by a man named Francis Nicholson's council to maintain order in late April. Remember, Andros and about 25 other Dominion leaders had been arrested by Boston rebels at this point. So Nicholson and the council feared that they could no longer contain the mob. They actually turned to Leisler to present the government's case to the people. And it's not actually until the end of May when Leisler's militia company he commanded came to him and literally begged him to lead them into capturing the fort. He finally agreed and cited Calvin's belief that leaders should, quote, apply themselves with the highest diligence to prevent freedom from being in any disrespect diminished, end quote. And this was his way of accepting his role in the rebellion. Leisler and about 49 of his men took the fort with relative ease, and that was because most of the New York and Jersey troops had been sent to Maine to deal with colonist and native fighting. And with this move, Leisler became the highest New York civil and military official in the glorious revolutionist cause. 3 of the New York Dominion councilors refused to acknowledge that King James had been usurped, but Lieutenant Governor Nicholson fled to England. Eventually, 2 of the remaining Dominion councilors fled to Albany and set up a sort of government in exile there. Remember how I said Leisler became even richer after he inherited his mother-in-law's estate when she died? Well, the other family members of the mother-in-law were trying to get that will changed in court. And guess who those family members were? The 2 Dominion leaders now heading up the opposing government in Albany, Nicholas Bayard and Stephen Van Cortlandt. Talk about small town. So you could say that the tension was pretty high in New York. Interestingly, small shopkeepers, small farmers, sailors, and poor traders and artisans sided with Leisler, and the wealthier people sided with Bayard and Van Cortlandt. By the end of 1689, the new English monarchs appeared to uphold both parties' rights to govern in a letter, but Leisler takes the letter and assumes the role of lieutenant governor over both his area and Albany, and he appoints a council. They vote to restore the New York government to what it had been before King James took over. One of Leisler's biggest fears was a takeover of the colonies by the Catholics, and he also believed the upcoming new millennia could bring about the second coming of Christ, so he needed to take swift action to protect the colonies. In February of 1690, his fear seemed to come true when the Catholic French teamed up with local natives to raid Synecdoche. I don't think that's right. Sorry, New York. When they raided Synecdoche, let me look it up. Can't be claiming to be a Yankees fan if I don't know how to say New York cities. But it looks like I'm pretty close. Schenectady, New York. All right. So the Catholic French team up with the local Indians and raid Schenectady, New York, which is one of the most important frontier outposts. Leisler's response was to issue general arrests of all Roman Catholics and asked all the other colonies to send delegates for a special committee to talk about how to proceed. Because it kind of seemed like they were now having to go to war against France when they had just kind of freed themselves from English rule. Delegates from Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut were the only ones to show. However, Maryland tried but got there too late. Virginia and Pennsylvania did not even respond. I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's pretty interesting. Leisler and William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, seem to have a lot of beef with each other. And so that's pretty much why Pennsylvania didn't respond. They were having a lot of infighting of who's going to control Pennsylvania. Was it the Quakers? Was it another group? So they were kind of busy with their own problems, and they also hated Leisler, which is kind of interesting. Probably honestly could be a whole other episode. But anyways, they refuse to show up. So does Virginia. Virginia's big and probably thinks that they're too cool for everyone. Anyway, they also weren't a part of the Dominion. So they're like, yeah, whatever. We're doing our own thing. But the people who showed up devised and executed a plan to attack the French army on multiple fronts. While they failed miserably, it's a poignant moment that the colonies independently rallied together and attempted to defend themselves without the help or intervention of the English. And it seems like quite the foreshadowing of what happens 100 years later. This actually marks the first intercolonial Congress in North America. Once King William was able to take a break from consolidating all his power in Ireland and Scotland and, fighting a global war against France, he remembered, oh yeah, I have those American colonies. I wonder how that's going. And he finally appoints an official English governor to New York in September of 1689, a man unfortunately named Henry Sloughter. And that's a little bit of my own foreshadowing there, folks. Slaughter's arrival to New York was a bit delayed, so an English military commander named Richard Ingoldsby actually got there first in January of 1691. Although Ingoldsby didn't have any authority, he still tried to get Leisler to surrender the fort. And Leisler, who was being hospitable to Ingoldsby and his men, was like, nah, I'm good. And so for the next couple months, while everyone waited for Sloughter to show up, New York got closer and closer to an all-out civil war. Tensions finally reached a breaking point in mid-March, and a battle broke out between Ingoldsby's soldiers and Leisler's militia, in which 2 men were killed and several more were injured. And just in time, Sloughter finally arrives a couple days after this skirmish and arrests Leisler, his council, and about 27 others, and they're all tried for treason. And in a major L for Leisler and his men, the former Dominion leader, Joseph Dudley, comes back as part of the council. Joseph Dudley comes back as part of the council that presides over the trial, as well as good old Ingoldsby. And that's not all. Remember Bayard and Van Cortlandt, the dude suing Leisler over his mother-in-law's estate? They also joined the council. So it pretty much seems like anyone and everyone who had beef with Leisler got the last laugh. Leisler, his son-in-law, Jacob Milburn, and a handful of others are sentenced to be hanged, disemboweled, and drawn and quartered. Sloughter didn't want to sign the execution orders because he said Leisler had, quote, first raised the standard of William of Orange and Protestantism, end quote, and kept the peace while waiting for further instruction from England. The anti-Leiserian faction kept pressuring Sloughter to sign the papers, and supposedly they got him to sign the execution papers when he was very drunk. The anti-Leiserian faction needed to put an immediate end to even the thought of a rebellion, and they made an example of Leisler and his men by having them all immediately killed. We don't need to go into the details, but just know that they were killed. This part is crazy to me because Leisler, like Sloughter said, was actually in support of the new king, and he just didn't surrender to Ingoldsby because Ingoldsby technically didn't have the authority to run the colony either. But I think Leisler was tried and executed for treason, more so for the fact that he was so successful in gaining the support of the colonists and was very popular, which was most likely viewed as a threat. And the new governor and the anti-Leiserian homies needed to establish authority and get everyone back in line. And a great way to do that is with violence and the threat of violence. And while Leisler's rebellion was short-lived, it had serious ramifications for decades, if not centuries to come. So what were some of the ramifications and aftermath of Leisler's rebellion? First, I would say that anti-Catholic sentiments would remain strong in the colonies and honestly through much of American history. The second rise of the KKK had strong anti-Catholic views, and JFK being Catholic was a huge deal in the 1960s. And shortly after Leisler's rebellion, Catholicism was actually illegal until 1783. Leisler's populist Protestant policies, nice little alliteration there, and agenda would also remain very popular in New York, and it actually divided the colony into what they called Leiserian and anti-Leiserian political factions, and this lasted for several decades after the rebellion. In May of 1695, the English Parliament reversed the Act of Attainder on Leisler's estate, which allowed his heirs to actually inherit his estate. Since he was found guilty of treason, his heirs were not allowed to inherit the estate. So the Parliament reversed that a few years later. And in 1698, his remains were finally allowed to be buried at the new Dutch Reformed Church on Garden Street in New York. And again, in a similar vein to last week's episode about Nathaniel Bacon, was Jacob Leisler fighting for the average New York colonist against an oppressive monarchy? Or was he a religious zealot who was paranoid about a Catholic takeover and tried taking matters into his own hands? So there's not a lot of primary sources and evidence for historians to go on, but most agree that ethnicity, class, and religious affiliation played a role in whether someone was pro or anti-Leiserian. So it could just be the fact that the Glorious Revolution left New York in a power vacuum and different factions tried to step in, and Leisler was the one who came out on top. While we can't know what was in Leisler's heart, I think he is a good example of a historical figure who is complicated and honestly just human. I think we're so quick to put historical figures up on a pedestal, almost next to godliness, or we want to damn them to hell. When in reality, these figures are human beings that are interesting to learn and study. Leisler participated in the indentured servant and transatlantic slave trade, tried arresting every single Roman Catholic once he assumed power, but he also financed many Protestant refugees' moves to North America and bought them land where they could live safely. He called for the first intercolonial meeting and helped to organize a defense against the French army. And although he was one of the wealthiest men in New York, he had the support of small business owners and poor farmers. I think that's why studying history is so interesting and important. And it's important to view historical figures objectively, and we can recognize the good and the bad at the same time. It doesn't have to be either or. But anyway, I'll get off my little history soapbox. So whether or not Leisler was a paranoid religious tyrant or genuinely wanted to protect his fellow colonists from religious persecution and unfair taxes, I think the general uprisings we see in both New York and Boston at this time are a precursor to the American Revolution. More so than Bacon's rebellion was, at least. You see the colonists citing the Magna Carta section of taxation through representation. There's colonists and officials refusing to abide by the new Dominion laws. And there was also a group of Bostonians who arrested the Dominion leaders and enacted the laws that were in place before the Dominion. We also see the first intercolonial meeting, like we just talked about, and the first time that they're trying to defend themselves without the help of the English. I think this movement was larger. I think this movement was larger than just Leisler, and I think it speaks more to the mindset of many colonialists who wanted to have their autonomy and freedom from England and fought back when they felt it was being taken away. You also see the emerging tensions between the more wealthy upper class and the working farmers and poorer people, which is another common theme from last week and something America has seemingly always struggled with. But that was the story of Jacob Leisler and his rebellion. All the sources I used are in this episode's show notes. I hope you enjoyed it, and join us next week for another story from America's rebellious past. Bye!